Well, hello there, and welcome to Old Retold. I'm your host, Sammy, here to do what your high school English teacher never dared: cut the fluff, ditch the homework, and show you why these old stories still pack a punch. With more sarcasm, less suffering. This is Old Retold, where dusty classics get dragged out of the attic, shaken free of mothballs, and given a cheeky once-over. The year is 1605, and a poor author named Miguel de Cervantes has just printed the first half of a story that would make him famous forever, though he didn't earn a penny from it. Cervantes had lived a life and a half already. He fought bravely at Lepanto, where he was shot through the arm. He was captured by Barbary pirates and chained in Algiers for 5 years. He came home only to find poverty waiting. He worked as a tax collector and ended up in jail. When all was nearly lost, Cervantes picked up his battered quill and thought, right, I'll write the sort of tale that takes the mick out of all those daft night stories clogging every bookstall. Back then, Spain was obsessed with these flowery tales of noble knights rescuing maidens and tilting at dragons that never existed. It was the equivalent of today's superhero movies. Same story, different heights. Cervantes, half crippled from war, broke from debt, and fresh out of prison, decided he'd poke fun at the whole lot. Just a parody, a joke to pass the time. But what he did instead was stumble into inventing the modern novel. Not bad for a man who'd spent more time in chains than in comfort. Don Quixote didn't just tell a story, it thought about storytelling. It laughed at its own characters, winked at the reader, and showed us people who were gloriously ridiculous, yet heartbreakingly human. That's why it's often called the first true novel, because it had realism, psychology, and a cheeky self-awareness that no one had dared before. And of course, out of Cervantes' mad knight on a tired old horse came a word we still use today: quixotic, meaning chasing impossible dreams, jousting at windmills, or, as your mate down the pub might put it, living in cloud cuckoo land. So, here was Cervantes, a soldier turned prisoner, a clerk turned convict, a failed poet turned genius by accident, giving the world a book that changed literature forever. So buckle up, this is Old Retold retell of Don Quixote. In the dusty flatlands of La Mancha, his story begins with a gentleman of about 50, lean of face, tall of frame, the sort of fellow who looks like a bundle of sticks in a hat. He kept a housekeeper past 40, a niece not yet 20, and a greyhound who never caught anything but fleas. His name we needn't worry too much about because, once his brains dried out from reading too many books, he gave himself a new one anyway. Day and night he sat with romances of chivalry, knights charging giants, ladies fainting at the sight of blood, sorcerers, battles, enchanted castles. He read until he stopped sleeping, until his food went untouched, until his head turned to ash. And one morning, somewhere between dream and madness, he declared, "Spain has need of knights again, and I shall be one." First things first, equipment. He dug out the rusting armour his great-grandfather had once paraded in. It was useless. The helmet was cracked, the visor missing. He patched it up with pasteboard, think cardboard glued together, the kind of thing you'd use for a school project, not a battlefield. To test it, he gave it a swing with his sword, and it crumpled like a paper cup. He patched it again, thicker this time, but thought better of testing it twice. A knight must trust in fate, he told himself. For a horse, he had only an old nag used to dragging ploughs. Ribs poked through its skin like harp strings, knees buckled with every step. But he declared this nag the finest steed in the world, and christened it Rocinante, which means something like, from nag to number 1. Then he gave himself a name, Don Quixote de la Mancha. And because no knight can ride without a lady to inspire him, he plucked a farmer's daughter from memory, Aldonza Lorenzo, who was more used to slinging hay bales than sighing at serenades, and renamed her Dulcinea del Toboso, fairest of ladies, though she had never heard of him. Thus prepared, he rode out one July morning, thin armour squeaking, patched visor bobbing, lance tucked under his arm. He had no squire, no money, not even clean linen. He rode until he reached what to him was a castle, but to the rest of the world was a country inn, smoke curling from the kitchen, hens scratching in the dirt. 2 country girls stood at the door laughing. Don Quixote bowed so low, Rocinante nearly toppled. "Noble ladies," he he declared. "Grant shelter to a knight." They burst out giggling but led him in. The innkeeper was a big fellow, used to fools and drunks. He recognised this one was mad as a hatter, but he played along. Don Quixote said, "I must be dubbed a knight at once." The innkeeper replied, "Of course! Tomorrow morning with great ceremony." That night, Don Quixote insisted on guarding his armour in the courtyard, as true knights did before being dubbed. He laid the pieces on a water trough and paced with his lance. Along came a mule driver to water his beasts. He shoved the armour aside. Don Quixote roared, "Thief! You dare touch sacred arms!" and brought his lance down on the man's head. Another mule driver joined. Stones flew, shouting filled the yard. The innkeeper feared murder. To get rid of him, he grabbed a book, tapped Don Quixote on the shoulder, and said, "There, you are now a knight. Congratulations. Now go." Don Quixote fell to his knees, overjoyed, swearing eternal thanks, but the night wasn't done with him. Don Quixote couldn't spend a single evening in an inn without turning it into a battlefield. This time the spark was the servant girl, Maritornes. She was no storybook beauty, cross-eyed, hump-backed, hands rough from hard work, but lively enough, with a sense of humour that carried her through the chores. That night she had arranged to meet a mule driver out by the stables. As Maritornes crossed the yard, Quixote stirred in his straw bed. His ears caught the sound of footsteps, and his heart leapt. To him, it could only be that Dulcinea del Toboso had come to see him, the lady he had sworn allegiance to, whether she knew it or not. So he rose, arms outstretched, and whispered her name like a prayer. "Dulcinea! My queen! My destiny!" Poor Maritornes nearly screamed the yard down. One moment she was hurrying along, the next she was snatched into an embrace by a gaunt man in battered armour, muttering endearments to a woman she'd never heard of. She wriggled free, shrieking, and in stormed the mule driver. His fists spoke fluent outrage. Rocinante reared in panic, knocking into beams, and the stable erupted in chaos. By dawn, the inn looked as if it had hosted a country fair gone wrong. Quixote lay bruised and battered, yet he staggered out smiling, convinced he had won a mighty battle for Dulcinea's honour. Without paying a coin, he mounted Rocinante and declared, "A true knight carries honour, not money." The innkeeper spat after him, "May the devil take you and your honour." That's the magic of his madness. The world throws him bruises, but he gathers them up as trophies. Not far down the road, Quixote met worse luck. He spied a company of merchants from Toledo riding along, mules packed high with goods, servants trailing behind. Ordinary traders, just minding their business. But Quixote saw them as the perfect opportunity for knightly glory. He rode Rocinante right into their path, lance lowered like a man about to joust with reality itself. "Halt," he cried. "Confess at once that there is no lady more beautiful than Dulcinea del Toboso." The merchants blinked. One of them, used to bargaining over sacks of cloth, not declarations of love, tried to humour him. "Sir Knight," he said, "show us this lady. If she is as fair as you claim, we will gladly confess." But of course Quixote couldn't show them. Dulcinea existed only in his head. He snapped back, "You will confess without seeing. Her perfection admits no proof, only faith." The merchants glanced at each other. One muttered, "Is he drunk?" Another said, "We've no time for fools." They tried to ride past. That was enough to set Quixote off. He spurred poor Rocinante, who lurched forward like a cart horse forced into battle. Quixote charged, lance wobbling. At the first bump, Rocinante stumbled, sending Quixote tumbling to the dust. Before he could rise, one of the mule drivers swung a stick and cracked him across the ribs. Another gave him a kick for good measure. There he lay, armour dented, lungs wheezing, dignity scattered like straw. The merchants rode on, laughing at the madmen who demanded they swear loyalty to an invisible princess. Hours later, a passing neighbour from his village spotted him in the ditch. "Saints preserve us! It's Quixote!" He hauled him up, slung him across his donkey, and carted him home, while Quixote drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring Dulcinea's name, as if she'd been at his side in battle. While Don Quixote lay in bed, groaning over bruises and muttering Dulcinea's name like a prayer, his household gathered in secret council. The housekeeper clutched her apron, the niece wrung her hands, and both declared the true culprit, the cursed books. To settle the matter, the priest and the barber arrived, two of his oldest friends. They shook their heads at the shelves stuffed with tales of knights, giants, and sorcerers. "If he hadn't read these," said the barber, "he'd be mending fences instead of tilting at them." The priest agreed. So, the great trial began. The priest picked up each book in turn, read the title aloud, and passed judgment. Some were spared for being clever, or at least harmless, but most were condemned without appeal. The barber carried out the sentence, dragging armfuls of leather-bound romances into the courtyard. There, the housekeeper was waiting with a torch. One by one, the volumes landed on the pile. Brave knights, fair maidens, enchanted castles, all fuel for the flames. The torch kissed the pages, smoke rose and the fire crackled with the sound of whole worlds burning. By the time Don Quixote stirred from his sick bed and wandered to his beloved library, the door was bricked up. He stared, stunned. "Where are my books?" he asked. His niece, with a straight face, replied, "An enchanter came in the night, uncle, and carried them all away." Quixote nodded slowly, as if it explained everything. "Yes, it was Freston the wizard. He envies my fame. Only a great knight would earn such an enemy." And so, what was meant as a cure only deepened the madness. The fire had devoured the books, but the stories burned brighter than ever in his head. This time he would not go alone. He turned to a neighbour, Sancho Panza. By the way, Panza literally means big belly, a farmer as round as a wine cask, fond of his naps, and owner of a donkey steadier than Rocinante. Don Quixote promised him an island to govern. Sancho, half greedy and half gullible, thought, well, why not? Stranger things have happened. He packed his saddlebag with bread, cheese, and a skin of wine, climbed his donkey, and trotted after the knight. Picture them on the road, the tall, skeletal man wobbling on a bag of bones with hooves, and beside him a squat farmer on a donkey, belly bouncing, already dreaming of his governorship. One hot afternoon, they came upon 30 or 40 windmills turning their arms against the sky. Don Quixote stiffened. "Giants, Sancho! Do you see them?" "Their arms are a league long," Sancho squinted. "Master, those are windmills. The arms are sails." Don Quixote raised his lance. "It is their fate to fall to my hand," he spurred Rocinante. The horse stumbled forward gamely. Quixote's lance struck a sail, the wind caught it, and the giant arm whirled him and his horse through the air. He landed in a heap, visor cracked, ribs aching. Sancho hurried over. "Did I not say they were windmills?" Don Quixote groaned. "Silence, Sancho." "The wizard Freston turned them to windmills to rob me of glory." Sancho sighed, thinking the promised island might never arrive. Not long after, they heard cries. A boy named Andres was tied to a tree, whipped by his master for demanding wages. Don Quixote thundered up like a knight descending from legend. "Unhand him, villain! Do you dare strike a helpless boy? Pay him what you owe at once, or feel my lance in your hide." The farmer froze, staring at the gaunt horseman in rusty armour. He stammered, swore he would pay, promised by heaven and earth. Quixote nodded with grave satisfaction. "You see, Sancho, thus is justice restored when a knight rides abroad." He cut Andres loose, delivered a lecture on honour, and with a flourish rode away, head high, already composing verses about his triumph. But as soon as he was gone, the farmer beat Andres worse than before. The boy cried after him, but Quixote was already composing verses about his own bravery. Sancho muttered, "That boy won't be praising you, master." Further on, after trudging miles under the hot sun, another quarrel rolled their way. They met a coach carrying a Biscayan lady, guarded by her squire. Don Quixote, chest swelling with knightly pride, planted Rocinante in their path. "Stop, good sir," he cried to the squire. "You must confess that Dulcinea del Toboso is the most beautiful lady in the world." The Biscayan blinked, then barked out a laugh and spat out, "You are a lunatic. Out of my way or I'll knock your teeth down your throat." That was enough. Quixote's blood boiled. He lowered his lance and thundered, "Then defend yourself, villain." The Biscayan, with no sword ready, seized a cushion from the coach and held it up like a shield. With that, the two charged, Quixote with his lance, the Biscayan with his cushion. Dust flew, the mules reared, and the lady shrieked inside the coach. By some miracle of clumsiness, Quixote's lance struck home, splitting the Biscayan's head. Blood poured, the squire staggered. The lady screamed louder, begging Quixote to spare him. "For the love of heaven, let him live! He is my servant." Quixote lifted his lance, noble as a king. "Very well," he declared, "on one condition. This man must go to Toboso and present himself before Dulcinea, confessing her beauty to be second to none." The Biscayan, dazed and bleeding, nodded anything to stop the madness. Sancho, meanwhile, tugged at Rocinante's reins and muttered, "Best we hurry, master, before his cousins come down the road." And off they went for days to come, Rocinante stumbling while Sancho's donkey plodded faithfully beside, the pair rattling down the road, leaving chaos in their wake, both convinced Spain was safer thanks to them. Sancho muttered about his empty belly, tugging at the wineskin, while Don Quixote straightened in the saddle and pointed ahead, declaring with absolute certainty that another trial of arms was waiting somewhere on the road. And wouldn't you know it, later in their wandering, as a light rain began to fall, they spied a rider coming their way. It was a humble barber on a mule. To keep dry, he had set a shining brass basin upside down upon his head. Don Quixote's eyes lit up. He gasped, trembling with joy. "Behold, Sancho! Do you see?" he said excitedly. "A knight approaches, armed in gold, wearing the fabled helmet of Mambrino itself, said to render its wearer invincible, and, by fortune, it falls to me." Sancho shaded his eyes and saw only a barber in a shabby tunic, basin gleaming with raindrops. "Master, that's no knight, that's a barber with a wash basin, for soap, for beards, for dirty faces. If that's a helmet, I'll eat Rocinante's tail." But Quixote was already lowering his lance, urging poor Rocinante into a gallop that looked more like a limping trot. The barber looked up, saw a wild-eyed man in rust-eaten armour bearing down on him, and did the sensible thing. He screamed, tossed the basin aside, and bolted across the fields, robes flapping like laundry. Don Quixote scooped up the basin, jammed it onto his head, and declared, "A perfect fit. Behold, Sancho." And then he added proudly, "Destiny crowns me." Sancho stared at the basin wobbling round his master's ears like a soup pot and muttered, "Aye, master, it's a helmet right enough. For washing beards." Don Quixote puffed out his chest, proud as a king in gold, convinced the world had restored to him a relic of legend. Sancho trudged behind, shaking his head, wondering if madness was catching, and whether an island governor needed a helmet or just a bigger belt. That night they camped near a stream under a bright, nosy moon. The land was silent except for the crickets and Sancho's tragic moans. Then a terrible clanking broke the peace, a rhythmic pounding echoing through the valley like the heartbeat of a metal giant. Don Quixote froze, eyes blazing. "Giants, Sancho! Do you hear their hammering? They forge weapons to destroy us." Sancho's teeth began to chatter. "Master, let's turn back. I've a wife, children, and a donkey to feed. Giants aren't my business. I'm more of a small problems man. Goat stuck in a hedge, that sort of thing." "Cowardice!" Quixote snapped. "Stay if you must." "I shall meet my fate." He nudged Rocinante forward, who answered with the sigh of a horse that has seen things no horse should see. He crept along the riverbank, lance trembling in his grip, heart thumping. The clanking grew louder, bang, 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 as if a blacksmith with a grudge was thumping a cathedral. He burst into a clearing ready to strike and saw fulling mills, basically a 17th century version of a laundromat, only far louder, and without the convenience of coin slots. Sancho took one look and exploded into laughter so violent he nearly fell off his donkey. Don Quixote scowled. "Freston again. The wizard has transformed giants into machines to rob me of glory." Sancho wheezed, tears in his eyes. "Or maybe you're deaf as well as daft, master. That's laundry. Somewhere a shirt is getting the thrashing of its life." Don Quixote turned Rocinante with all the dignity a man in a brass basin can muster. "Even a knight may be deceived by sorcery. Let us away." Days later, after the moon had lost interest and the sun had found them again, they met a funeral procession. Men in black carried a coffin, Priests muttered prayers, and villagers shuffled with that slow, respectful tread the living put on for the dead. Don Quixote, certain it was a kidnapping by demons, blocked the road and lowered his lance. "Release your prisoner, fiends!" The mourners stopped, bewildered. "Sir," one priest said, gentle as butter, "it is a corpse." "A knight you've slain!" cried Quixote and charged. He scattered priests, toppled candles, knocked a hymn book into the ditch, and nearly overturned the coffin. Sancho stared at the chaos and muttered, "Someday, master, you'll attack a turnip cart because it looked at you funny." The dead, to their credit, remained calm about the whole thing. It wasn't long before they came to another inn. Sancho groaned, "Master, I beg you." "Not another inn. Trouble breeds in inns like flies on dung. If they bottled it, they'd make a fortune." But in they went. Supper was miserable. A crust of bread that tasted of sawdust, stew past its best years, and wine so sour it argued back. Sancho snored soon after, dreaming of kitchens that didn't smell like horse blankets. At dawn, Don Quixote tried to ride off without paying, declaring knights do not soil their honour with coin. The innkeeper, a man with 2 arms and a belly that meant business, barred the door. Words turned to shoves, shoves to blows, and a brawl erupted like a summer storm. The guests seized Sancho, round and easy to catch, and tossed him in a blanket, flinging him squealing into the rafters like a piglet at fair time. Don Quixote fought to reach him, but his helmet basin slid down over his eyes. He stumbled, was tripped, battered with ladles, and finally wedged in a doorway, like a broomstick jammed in a gate. Rocinante brayed for glory, reared for battle, and was sent back to his corner by a smack across the muzzle. At last, the tormentors tired. Sancho collapsed on the floorboards, wheezing, his belly wobbling like unset jelly. Quixote staggered free, armour dented, ribs aching, dignity gone. Together they limped out, unpaid and unbowed. "The bill," Quixote declared, "is settled in honour. Great men are tested by trials." Sancho rolled over and groaned, "I'm not great, I'm fat, and my trials squeak." Another day, on a softer road, Don Quixote grew philosophical. "Sancho, you must know that knights-errant never trouble doctors. We carry with us the recipe for the balsam of Fierabras, a potion so mighty that one sip will heal any wound." Sancho squinted at him. "What's in it then?" "Oil, wine, salt and rosemary," Quixote said proudly, as if unveiling the secrets of heaven. Sancho sniffed. "Sounds more like salad dressing than medicine." Quixote wagged a finger. "Mock it if you will, but with this balsam, a knight is invincible." Sancho shook his head, muttering about vinegar on wounds. Just then, Rocinante wandered off. The bony stallion, love-starved and wildly optimistic, spotted a herd of mares grazing nearby. He trotted over, did a little sideways dance that said, "Hello, ladies," and got no further. The mares kicked, and the Yangasean mule drivers tending them saw the intruder. With clubs in hand, they rained blows until Rocinante folded like a deck chair. Don Quixote, seeing his steed disgraced, roared with fury. He seized his lance and charged the whole gang, with the sort of confidence that melts in hot water. Seconds later, he was on the ground, armour dented, breath gone. Sancho, loyal to the last, dived in after him like a brave dumpling, only to be flattened and seasoned for good measure. The two lay groaning in the dust, as if the earth itself had punched them back down. Rocinante hobbled nearby, too sore even to whinny. Sancho croaked, "Master, where's your miracle balsam now?" Quixote sighed through cracked lips. "If only I had more rosemary." Sancho shut his eyes. "If only you had more brain." Still battered and looking like they'd been posted through a grinder, they stumbled on until they met a chain gang of galley slaves shackled at the neck, guarded by musketeers with faces like clenched fists. Don Quixote rode up and demanded, "Why are these men bound?" The captain shrugged. "Because they stole, cheated, murdered. The king's sentence is clear. They march to the galleys." "Injustice!" Quixote thundered, startling a sparrow from a bush. "No man should be chained. They must be free to choose virtue next time." Sancho buried his face in his hands. He could already see where this was heading. Quixote charged, scattering the guards like ninepins and breaking the slaves' chains with the flat of his sword, which was merciful because the edge had retired in the previous century. The prisoners cheered, hugged their liberator, kissed his hands, then promptly robbed Don Quixote and Sancho of everything they had, including a wedge of cheese Sancho had hidden in his sleeve, beat them for luck, and vanished into the hills, cackling. Sancho sat naked to the waist, bruised, dusty, clutching at the air where his lunch used to be. "Master," he said softly, the way a man speaks to a thunderstorm, "your charity will be the end of me." Don Quixote puffed out his chest, which squeaked in reply. "Better to free knaves than do nothing." "Better to keep your clothes," Sancho muttered, and draped the donkey's saddlecloth around himself like a nobleman's cloak. With nothing left but stubbornness and the wobbling basin, they retreated into the wild Sierra Morena, a tangle of peaks and ravines, and little green places where the wind sang through the pines like a choir rehearsing without a conductor. Don Quixote, remembering tales of knights who did penance in lonely mountains, declared he too must perform mad deeds for Dulcinea. He spun in circles, rolled in the dust, and declaimed verses with such force that the crickets fell silent. A bird perched to listen, cocked its head, and then flew off quickly because it was all getting a bit much. "Tell her, Sancho," he cried, hopping from one foot to the other in a way that did not scream dignity, "how I raged for her love. Tell her I am mad, but nobly mad." Sancho covered his eyes. "If I tell her that, she'll send a doctor, and the doctor will bring a very big net." "I am lost in love," Quixote shouted to the mountains. The mountains, trying to be polite, echoed back, "Love, love, love." "You're lost in lunacy," Sancho muttered, but with a kind of fondness, the way you get attached to a cracked teapot that still pours well enough. Out of the rocks stumbled a ragged man, wild-eyed and torn by brambles. It was Cardenio, once a gentleman, now a ruin in boots. At first he spoke calmly enough, a tale of love betrayed, of his Lucinda promised to another, of a false friend who stole her heart. But his words came in bursts, sharp as broken glass. One moment he was pleading, the next raging. "Love cuts deeper than steel." Sancho tried to lighten the mood. "Or a spoon," he offered. "A spoon can do damage too, if you're committed." But Cardenio was past listening. His fury boiled over mid-sentence. He flung himself at Don Quixote, scratching and shoving as if the knight were the shadow of his betrayal. And when Sancho tried to step in, he caught a backhand that spun him like a top. Moments later, Cardenio tore away into the mountains, vanishing among the rocks like an echo too wild to linger. Sancho rubbed his bruises. "Madness spreads fast. First you, now him. Give it a week and the goats will be at it." Sancho was beginning to wonder if madness was contagious when, by luck or fate, they crossed paths with two familiar figures. The parish priest from their village, the one who blamed books for every bruise Quixote carried, and the barber, Master Nicholas, whose scissors were sharp but whose patience sharper. These two had set out from home to track down their neighbour before his delusions killed him outright. Sancho told them everything: the mad deeds, the made-up lady, the basin helmet. The priest sighed so hard it bent the grass. "We must trick him home," he said, "or we'll be burying him in these hills." Not long after, in a fold of the mountains where a stream clattered over stones, they met Dorotea, a noblewoman disguised in shepherd's clothes. Her face was tired from travel, but her eyes burned with courage. She told her story plainly. Once she was the cherished daughter of a wealthy farmer. Don Fernando, a young nobleman, courted her with every promise under the sun, and swore by heaven he would marry her. She trusted him. He broke that oath, leaving her shamed and abandoned. To make matters worse, she learned he had then turned his attention to another woman, Lucinda. Yes, the very same lady Cardenio loved, until he was driven to madness. The priest saw their chance. If Dorotea would pretend to be a princess in need, they could lure Quixote back toward civilization and home. She agreed, showing a flair for theatre that would shame Madrid. Don Quixote swore to defend her honour with all the pomp of a man who only owned one good speech and reused it often. Dorotea knelt with regal gravity. "I am Princess Micomicona, My kingdom tormented by a giant. Only you, noble sir, can save me. Don Quixote swelled like a pastry in the oven. He thumped his chest with a clang that made everyone wince and pledged his arm, his life, and any other limbs required. Sancho leaned in. And master, remember, when she rewards you, I get my island. I don't need a big one, just enough land that when I fall down, I don't roll off. So off they went, Dorothea playing the princess with great drama, the priest and barber trailing with relief disguised as reverence, and Sancho muttering proverbs that multiplied like rabbits whenever he was hopeful. And wouldn't you know it, fate, with its wicked sense of humour, steered them straight back to the very same inn where Sancho had once been tossed in a blanket until he squealed like a piglet. The moment the crooked chimney came into view, Sancho groaned. Master, not that inn. They've still got my dignity hanging from the rafters. If inns are castles, then this one is my dungeon. Don Quixote, of course, saw only turrets and battlements where there were sagging beams. He spurred Rocinante forward, declaring, "Destiny calls me back." The innkeeper spotted them coming and muttered words best left untranslated. But inns were public houses, and with Dorothea looking noble as a queen, and the priest and barber lending an air of respectability, he couldn't exactly slam the door in their faces. So he swallowed his curses, plastered on a face that said hospitality but under protest, and waved them in. And then it happened. Don Quixote, true to his vow, was on constant lookout for the monstrous giant Princess Micomicona had described. He paced the inn-yard like a watchdog, muttering about destiny. Then his eyes fixed on a swollen wineskin, hanging from a beam, fat and bulging in the lantern light. To anyone else, it was nothing more than a skin of red wine, waiting to be poured. But to Quixote, it was the very giant that tormented Dorothea's kingdom. With a cry that startled chickens from their roost, he lowered his lance and slashed the wineskin wide open. Wine exploded out in a scarlet gush, spraying across the yard. Quixote staggered in the stream, soaked head to toe, shouting, "Behold! The giant bleeds!" The inn shook with laughter. Sancho scrambled beneath the flood, mouth open like a pilgrim at a holy spring, and declared, "The sweetest victory yet." The innkeeper's wife clutched her head. "Saints preserve us, he's murdered our best vintage." Don Quixote wiped wine from his eyes, bowed deeply to Dorothea, and said with perfect seriousness, "Princess, your giant is vanquished, your kingdom is free." Dorothea, slipping smoothly back into character, curtsied with equal seriousness. "Noble knight, you have saved us all." But the inn was not done with them. Inns never are. By evening, every room was stuffed. Travellers rolled in, all with their own dramas, until the place buzzed like a fairground. Into this chaos came Cardenio again, half mad and half shamed, raving about betrayal. With him, by some trick of chance, came Lucinda, pale and trembling, having fled her forced marriage. Dorothea, forgetting her princess act for a moment, gasped to see her old friend, and hot on her heels stormed Don Fernando, the very scoundrel who had abandoned Dorothea for Lucinda. It was like every lost love story in Spain had decided to meet up in the same inn on the same night. Voices rose. Lucinda fainted into Cardenio's arms. Dorothea confronted Don Fernando with the fury of a woman who'd carried shame too long. Fernando blustered, denied, swore, then broke down and admitted everything. He begged forgiveness, though he looked about as sorry as a cat caught with cream on its whiskers. The priest seized the moment, as priests do, to lecture about virtue. Don Quixote tried to step in with his lance, announcing he would solve all wrongs by force, but the barber tugged him back by the basin, whispering, "Stay out of this, Sir Knight." In the end, truth had its way. Don Fernando promised to restore Dorothea's honour and marry her properly. Lucinda clung to Cardenio, and everyone cried or cheered. The inn rang with vows and reconciliations. Sancho, not quite understanding, but moved by the mood, hugged the empty wineskin and whispered, "And I forgive you too." You'd think that would end the trouble. You'd be wrong. The innkeeper still wanted payment. Don Quixote, as ever, insisted knights pay only in glory. The innkeeper, having just lost a barrel of wine to glory, was not impressed. Tempers rose again. In the middle of the shouting, someone dragged in a bag of dried bread, someone else mistook it for treasure, fists flew, and before long half the guests were at each other's throats. Don Quixote, seeing combat, could not resist. He bellowed, lowered his lance, and charged another wineskin hanging from a beam, convinced it was a fresh giant come to life. He slashed it open, red wine spraying everywhere once more. The innkeeper shrieked as though stabbed. The guests howled with laughter. Sancho rolled on the floor, trying to drink from the puddle, and Rocinante, tied outside, neighed despair. When the brawl finally wheezed to an end, the inn looked like the aftermath of a storm. Plates smashed, wine soaking the floor. The priest rubbed his temples and whispered, "We must get him out before he brings down the roof." So they hatched a plan. The priest and the barber conspired with the innkeeper, built a wooden cage, large enough for a man, mounted on an ox cart, and convinced Don Quixote he was being carried by enchantment. "Say an enchanter has captured him," the barber said, "and that only Dulcinea's command can free him." The innkeeper, eager to see the back of them, agreed at once. The next morning they brought the cage, solemn as judges. Don Quixote, when told the sorcerer Freston had imprisoned him by magic, sighed deeply. "So be it. Fate cannot be resisted. Let us go, Sancho." He entered the cage without a fight, sat cross-legged, and recited poetry about captives and glory. The oxen lurched forward, pulling him away from the inn, while the whole procession followed like a travelling circus. Sancho trudged beside the cart, still arguing. "Master, you can't really believe you're trapped. The bars are wooden, and I can touch you." "Touch, yes," Don Quixote said serenely, "but break them. No, magic is strong. Only Dulcinea's command will free me." Sancho scratched his head. "Then may Dulcinea hurry, for my feet are blistered and my stomach empty." The priest rode alongside, pleased with himself, though he muttered prayers to steady his conscience as the barber dozed on his mule. For days they travelled thus, the wooden cage creaking, Don Quixote declaiming about honour, while flies buzzed round his basin. At villages they passed, children ran out to gape, shouting, "Look, a knight in a cart!" Women crossed themselves, old men laughed until their beards shook. Sancho grew weary of explaining his master's greatness to jeering crowds, but Don Quixote never faltered. "Mockery is the tribute paid by envy," he intoned, which made no one laugh harder than Sancho himself. At last, after many weary miles, they reached La Mancha. The housekeeper and niece wept to see him brought back in a cage. Neighbours gathered to jeer or gape. The priest ordered him carried inside, where the women blessed the rescuers and shut the door. Don Quixote, still convinced he was enchanted, lay on his bed and plotted fresh adventures for the day Dulcinea released him. Sancho sat outside on a bench, rubbing his belly, telling anyone who'd listen that an island was owed to him, and if it didn't come soon, he'd demand two. And so Don Quixote's first grand adventure ended not with a crown, nor with a kingdom, but with a cage rattling on an ox cart. Everyone else saw a broken man dragged home. He saw himself as a hero under enchantment, biding his time until Dulcinea lifted the spell. Sancho trudged along, ribs aching, stomach empty, still clinging to the dream of his island. The priest muttered prayers, the barber dozed, and the innkeeper finally slept easy, knowing the trouble had rolled out with the oxen. But Quixote? He lay in bed in La Mancha, staring at the ceiling beams as though they were stars, already plotting the next impossible quest. And that's where Book 1 leaves us. A knight who found giants in wineskins, castles and inns, and destiny in a donkey's shadow. And a squire who, against all reasons, still followed him. And maybe that's the secret. The world calls it madness, but it's also the courage to keep pretending life is bigger than it looks. And honestly, between us, wouldn't you rather live in a world where inns are castles and wine is dragon's blood? You've been listening to Old Retold podcast. Classic stories abridged and brought to life once more. If you've enjoyed this tale, be sure to follow and join me again, where another timeless story waits to be retold. Until next time, pour a cuppa. Look out for another twiddly detail, where old stories play dress up in the present.